Will you use this for the intro? It's a good house, isn't it? Bending down for the water's bad. Bending down for the water's bad, so if I had a stool.
Do you want a chair?
I have a chair, but I'm scared of spilling it.
Okay. Is it up to me to start, or when do I?
Where's our producers? Go for it. Right.
No?
Make sure your mic's on. Hello? Where's Dean?
Good afternoon, everyone. Very warm welcome to panel 4901. This is a storytelling performance, so there will be no question time at the end. The title of this piece is All for the Dead Man's Penny, and it is a collaborative piece between Liz Weir, who's an international storyteller and who really needs no introduction, and my own father, Kieran Mulholland, who can't be here today, but I am honoured to stand in for him. So this is the first time this piece has been performed in the USA, so that's exciting. And Liz and my father have recorded an album recently of this piece. Just a few housekeeping rules. If you've got a phone or an iPod or an iPad or anything that makes a bleepy noise, just please turn it off. And Liz, would you like to say a few words before we start?
Thank you. Well, good afternoon. This is sort of special. This is very different from my normal storytelling. You'll see I even have a script in front of me because Emma, as she said, is standing in for her father who composed the music. And so if I mess up, it messes her up. So I've got this. Also, it's an original piece that I wrote. It's the story of a young Irish soldier in World War I, and it brings it right up to date. As you may know, in Easter 1916, there was a rebellion in the south of Ireland. People rebelled against the Crown forces, but an awful lot of young Irishmen were away fighting for Britain at that time. And so this is looking what happened. When they came home, people didn't want to know them really because they'd been on the other side. And they haven't been mourned and memorialised enough. So I wanted to do this. So you'll have to get the music on your ear, my accent on your ear, and the fact that I've interwoven this story with the traditional Irish story, the tale of the Queen of the Lonely Isle. So 1 minute you'll be hearing one thing, then it'll switch, but older audiences are very intelligent. You'll get this. At the end, we're not going to do question and answer, but this is the last panel in here, so if you want to come up and chat, that's okay. We'll try and clear out and let the sound people get out as well. So we hope you'll enjoy it. It was inspired by a man, if you didn't get a flyer, we've still a few of them, inspired by this man in the back. His name was John Wilson. And I work with the Alzheimer's Society, and his great niece, or his own niece, who's 88 years old, told me his story. He died at 19. So there's a lot of that in this story. All right, let the battle commence. The grey road stops at the sea that rocks the island of the dead, where the unclaimed and the unbaptized are abandoned to a dull, harsh rest, restless as absence, elusive as the smells of a childhood kitchen. Off the coast of Donegal near Carrickfinn lies Uillinn na Marav, the island of the dead, a place where over 500 unbaptized babies were laid to rest, a place that was not spoken about, where those who could not be buried in consecrated ground were buried often at night and in secret. A father might make the long, lonely walk with a small box under his arm, leaving his little one at a quiet spot at the margin between land and sea. The belief at that time was that those children were in limbo, that place known as the hem of the curtain between heaven and hell. Mothers and fathers could be seen standing on the pier, looking out at that island, unable to grieve or mourn in a proper fashion. One such family were the Cassidys, already the parents of 3 fine sons. Their last child, a little girl, was stillborn. John Joe was the eldest, a boy who was named after his father and grandfather, a boy who would grow into a man, remembering his mother's tears for the daughter lost to her. Unspoken of, but not forgotten. There'd be no more babies in that house, and it seemed as if laughter had left the home. Whenever he could, John Joe would escape to spend hours over at his granny's house. There was always the smell of burning turf and scones baking on the griddle. He'd sit by her fireside, listening to her telling the old stories of Cuchulainn, Finn and Oisin. His granny would always say, "Sure, nobody will remember these stories after I've gone. 100 years from now, who's going to care about all this nonsense?" But John Joe loved to listen. While she told him tales of the great Irish heroes overcoming enemies in battle, John Joe imagined what adventures he'd have when he grew up. He'd leave Donegal and go out and see the world. He never forgot her stories. On a day of days, on an hour of hours, the King of Donegal went out hunting. He was proud of his prowess as a sportsman. One of his hounds put up a fox. She left the hounds behind her and all the huntsmen too, except the king. He stuck to that fox over hill and vale and long green plain until late on in the evening the fox reached the River Shannon and plunged in, swimming out of sight towards the mouth of the river, so the king could no longer see her. The next day, the king set off again, and didn't he put up the self-same fox? Once again, the fox outstripped him and all the hounds and huntsmen. He followed her once over hill and dale and long green plain until she reached the banks of the River Shannon, sprang into the river and swam till she was out of sight. That night, when the king got home, he swore that if he started that self-same fox the next day, he would chase it and catch it and kill it. Well, sure enough, on the third day, the fox was started from the same spot. This time the king's hound almost had her. He grabbed her by the heel, but she freed herself and kept on running, outdistancing all the hounds and all the huntsmen save for the king. Once more he followed her over hill and vale and long green plain until they reached the banks of the River Shannon. fox leapt in, swimming towards the river's mouth, and the king plunged his horse in. And as fast as the fox swam, sure the king's horse didn't swim any less fast. And at last, the fox reached an island far out to sea. The king reached the island and followed the trail of blood from the fox's heel through the undergrowth until he came to a little cabin, the only source of human habitation he'd seen. He lost all trail of the fox and the blood. He decided to inquire inside the cabin. There he found an old woman sitting by the fireside, washing a wounded, bleeding heel. Such was his pity for the poor old woman, the king knelt down and washed and dressed her wound. But he was amazed to see that the foot that he was holding was no longer rough and ugly, but had turned into the most beautiful, delicate foot he'd ever seen in his life. And the little cabin had been transformed into a dazzling hall of a magnificent palace. And instead of an old woman, he found he'd dressed the foot of the most beautiful maiden he'd ever seen. "What is the meaning of this?" said the king. The young damsel replied, "I am the queen of the island of loneliness. Sometimes I wish to see something more of the world, and so I changed my appearance. I was that self-same fox you chased. I was that same old woman whose foot you dressed. I had no intention of revealing myself to you, but you showed such kindness to a poor old woman, I decided to let you know the truth. You are most welcome to my court, and you may stay as long as you like on the island of loneliness." Well, the king was simply enchanted by the young woman and by everything he saw there. And as the days passed, he fell more and more in love with her. And a day turned into a week, and weeks into months. And at the end of 3 months' constant wooing, he asked her to be his bride, and she accepted. The king was happier with each day that passed, and he never gave any thought to his kingdom or the men he had left waiting for him. But after 6 months, he remembered his duty and begged his queen to be permitted to go back to his kingdom in Donegal to install a new king before returning to her side and live with her forever on the island of loneliness. They would never be parted again. The queen begged him not to leave her, but seeing how fervently he wished to return and how much it grieved him to leave his people without a king, she reluctantly agreed to let him go. She mounted him on a white steed that could travel as far over water as over land. She warned him not to let the lips of any human being touch him, any living being, for if he did so, he'd forget all about her and the island of loneliness. Well, the king promised. And he got on the magic steed, which carried him high and far and far. And when they reached the banks of the Shannon, there were his men still waiting for him. Tired and hungry, but they waited faithfully. Such was their delight that they rushed towards him, but he, remembering his promise, pushed them all away. But alas, his favourite hunting dog pushed past them, put its paws on the master's shoulders and licked his lips. And at that very instant, any memory of the queen and the island of loneliness just disappeared from his mind, and he rode back to Donegal, where he was welcomed by the people who had greatly lamented his loss. The century had brought many changes to the city of Derry. At just 15, Emma had no memory of the bombs which had torn the place apart in the violence of the more recent troubles. As she made her way across the diamond in the middle of the city, 2 bronze figures of a soldier with fixed bayonet and a sailor with barefoot were a visible reminder of the dead from the First World War. Emma was on her way to visit her granny Sarah, the one person that she could go to help her with her school project. Sarah's house was coming down with old photographs, and Emma's mum was always giving off about the mess and the clutter. Emma knew she'd be sure of a cup of tea, home-baked buns and plenty of chat at her granny's house. Emma loved history at school, and when the topic of the First World War came up, she had immediately known who to go to. Emma knew in her own house there was always discussion about Remembrance Day, when her mum insisted on wearing a poppy, whereas her dad, Eamon, said he wouldn't have one about him. Growing up as the product of a mixed marriage between a Protestant mother and a Catholic father, Emma realised her parents didn't always see eye to eye about the past. She had heard that as a teenager, her father had thrown stones at the British Army, whereas her mum had lived in the country, and she only knew about such things from the TV. Her dad thought wearing a poppy showed support for the British troops, for whom he had no love, but her mum felt it was for remembering all of those who died in war. Her dad preferred to wear the Easter lily in memory of Republicans who died in the Easter Rising of 1916, many executed by firing squad. Every year they had the same old debate. No point in asking either of them about the past. No, Granny Sarah was the one person who took the time to explain things. She was the obvious person to find out family history. Emma had phoned her up and asked her for any information she had about the First World War. Now she was on her way to her granny's bungalow, and when she went in, she had that great smell of baking. And Granny had a whole pile of photographs and papers covering the kitchen table. After she got sorted with a cup of tea and a freshly baked scone, Emma lifted a photograph of a young man in uniform. "Who's this, Granny?" "That's John Joe, my granda. Handsome, wasn't he? He was only about 24 when that was taken. He came from Donegal and married a Derry girl. Didn't go down too well with her family, I can tell you, him being Catholic. Of course, they'd never even call it Derry in that side of the family, just like my own when I was growing up. It was always called Londonderry. But we'd better start this story at the beginning. John Joe grew up in Donegal. His father was a fisherman, and he had 2 brothers, Michael and Patrick. His poor mother never got over the loss of a wee girl who was stillborn. In those days, unbaptised babies couldn't be buried in consecrated ground. They buried them off on an island within sight of the house. They called it the Island of the Dead. Wasn't that desperately sad? The poor wee souls. Anyway, John Joe's mother was haunted by the thought of her wee one out there all alone. John Joe, it seems, was a bit of a dreamer. He'd be off to his granny's any chance that he got. Seems she was a great shanachie, that's what they called a storyteller in those days. He had the gift of the gab himself, by all accounts. While his brothers, Michael and Patrick, decided to follow their father at the fishing, John Joe decided to go off further afield looking for work. Life in Donegal was very harsh in those early days of the 20th century, and for him it seemed as though their home was always tinged with sadness since the loss of that unnamed baby. He imagined her in his dreams, the little sister he'd never meet in this life, or perhaps in the next. John Joe travelled here to Derry, where there were more opportunities. Before long he found digs and a job in a factory not far from the city. He was a tall and handsome young man, and his soft Donegal accent found favour with the local girls. Sadie caught his eye right away. A small, dark-haired girl who was always laughing and joking. He'd seen her at a dance, and soon they were walking out together. He'd charm her by telling the stories he'd heard from his granny. She'd never heard stories like that in her house. For years after the king returned to Donegal, his people urged him to take a wife, but for some reason he wouldn't. Now, it so happened there was a handsome young princess there who wanted to marry the king and become Queen of Donegal. She used all her guile to persuade him to marry her, but she saw the mission was hopeless, and so she decided to try and incense his people so that they would make her queen after overthrowing the king. At last she found 3 fearsome giants from the Scottish Isles and made a bargain with them. They would come and challenge the king's champion for gold, and after killing them, make her the Queen of Donegal. Now, less than 6 months after the king had left the Island of Loneliness, his queen had given birth to a boy. It was his 18th birthday, and she called her son to him and said, "Your father is the King of Donegal. He left the island before you were born, and now he's lost all memory of it and of me. Will you risk your life to save your father?" The young prince said, "Surely I would risk my life to save my father." She told him that 3 fearsome Scottish giants had come to kill the king's champions and overthrow him. From the walls of her castle she took a mighty sword, which she called the Sword of Victory. "With this sword in your hand, you'll be invincible. When you've saved your father, tell him who you are, where you came from, and maybe he'll remember me." Taking his hand, she led her son into the castle garden. Plucking a yellow sunflower, she threw it in the air where it turned into a yellow balloon. Putting her son inside, she blew 3 times till it rose in the air. The balloon travelled high over land and over sea until it landed in Donegal, close to the king's castle. When he arrived, he did so just in the nick of time, as none of the king's champions could defeat the Scottish giants. 9 champions have already been killed, and the rest were too frightened to go up against them. The young prince stepped out for battle against the smallest giant, who laughed when he saw a lad of 18 go up against him. He put one finger to the lad and pushed him a mile away, saying, "I scorn to kill children." The prince immediately drew his sword, shouting, "Sword be at him!" and flew it in such a great rage that the giant had to fight, and a terrible fight began, the most terrible fight ever to be seen in Donegal, and at last the prince gave a bound in the air and ran the Sword of Victory through the giant, killing him. Next he went against the second giant, who also laughed when he saw a lad of 18 standing before him. "I scorn to kill children," pushing the boy with his finger 3 miles away. But the prince drew his sword, shouting, "Sword be at him," and flew into such great rage the giant had to fight. And a terrible fight it was, the most terrible fight ever seen in Donegal, until at last the boy bounded in the air and ran the Sword of Victory through the prince, killing him. That only left the third giant, who also mocked the 18-year-old standing before him, pushing him with his finger, so he pushed him 7 miles away. But Once again, the lad drew his sword, shouting, "Sword be at him," and attacked with such fury the giant had to fight. And it was the most terrible fight ever seen in Donegal, until at last the prince drove his sword into the giant, killing him. Then there was such rejoicing in the court. The king had the young man brought into the castle, set beside him. He asked him who he was and where he was from. The boy said, "I come from the island of loneliness. My mother is the queen of the lonely isle, and my father is the king of Donegal." "Huh, that's false," said the king. "I've never heard of the lonely isle or its queen." The boy did his best to try and make the king remember, but the king said the boy was simply crazed with battle. But the bad princess feared that there must be some truth in it, and she worked on the king, and although he wouldn't have the boy killed, he agreed to have the boy cast adrift in an open boat. So far from land the boy was taken. Without food and water, he was cast adrift. But back on the island of loneliness, the queen saw what was happening. She took a reel of purple ribbon, threw it out. One end attached itself to the boat, and she pulled her son safely back to the island of loneliness. John, Joe and Sadie knew from the start that the road ahead of them wouldn't be easy. Him being from Donegal and a Catholic, and her being a Protestant Derry girl. But they'd fallen in love, and John Joe was determined they'd make it work, a bit like your own parents, Emma. Sarah was just as headstrong as he was. Letters from home kept him informed about the Cassidys, but he said very little about the blossoming romance. He was a 21-year-old man, old enough to make his own choices. Things were getting very serious with Sadie. They spoke of marriage. But when she found herself expecting a child, John Joe didn't hesitate to make her his wife, even though it meant going through a ceremony that wouldn't be recognised in the eyes of his own church or family. He loved Sadie with all his heart, and he would do what he could to ensure that their child would carry his name. Until the infant was safely delivered, his thoughts constantly drifted back to those little ones on Ulan na Marav. John Joe got on with his workmates, but as rumours of war started, many of the men talked about joining up. In 1914, when the war broke out, recruitment posters were appearing and men were leaving their workbenches to take the king's shilling. Sadie's two brothers were amongst the first to join the Ulster Division, but John Joe was too preoccupied to care. Sadie's time was near, and he was worried sick that the baby would be born safely, even if it was into a world full of talk of war and death. But come she did, and they named her Josephine. He hoped the news of her birth would be of some comfort to his family back in Donegal. The war was affecting the mill as more and more men were joining the army. Famous for its linen production, it now turned its focus to making wings for airplanes. There was a lot of talk about men who had not yet enlisted, and John Joe heard some of the girls talking about him, and there was a coolness towards him and to others who had not joined up. He and Sadie discussed it, and he knew there was moral pressure coming from her family, but she maintained that it was his right. He was a proud Irishman, through and through. His brother Patrick's letters from Donegal brought news of home rule, the struggle for it, but here in Derry, all the young men were talking about fighting for king and country. John Joe knew all this talk was upsetting Sadie, and he tried to reassure her. When they sat quietly together in the evening, he told her the old stories he'd heard from his granny when he was a boy. after the battle with the giants, the queen called her son to her and said, "Today your father is in real peril. The princess who's working against him has called for 3 fleets of ships from the Scottish Isles. They're coming to attack him in his castle. Will you again risk your life to save your father?" And the young prince said, "It would be an honour to risk my life for my father." So the queen took the boy out to the castle gate. Down by the seashore, she plucked a lily that grew by the wall. She threw it on the waters, where it transformed into a tiny ship, fully rigged, manned with tiny men. She took 3 stones from her pockets and said, "Get into the boat, go to the harbour beside your father's castle, and into each of these 3 fleets throw one of these stones. Your father's life will then be saved." The prince got aboard the boat that immediately started over the water with the speed of light, and in a short time they came to the harbour by his father's castle. There he saw 3 fleets of ships getting ready to attack. As he went out in his little boat against them, the captains of the 3 ships, when they saw him, scorned the little fellow, as they called him. Up to the first fleet he sailed and threw a stone into the middle of it, and it caught fire. Up to the second fleet he threw another stone, it caught fire. And at last he charged the 3rd fleet, threw in the stone, and all 3 fleets were burnt upon the waters. The king and his people went down to the sea wall, and there was great rejoicing. The king had liked the young prince and was sad to send him away. So again he said, "Who are you? Where have you come from?" The young prince said, "I have been at home on the island of the loneliness with the queen, my mother. She sent me here to save my father, the king of Donegal." The king was sorry to hear that. The poor boy is crazed with battle. But the princess worked on the king again, and he agreed to have the boy led up to the edge of a cliff and set to walk blindfold over it. And when the day came, and the boy was led up to the cliff and blindfolded, the queen knew from the island of loneliness what was happening. And she took a golden clue, a silken thread, and threw it. And it reached the cliff top, and immediately a golden bridge spanned from the cliff top back to the island of loneliness, and over the bridge the young boy passed safely to his home. All over the island of Ireland, men were joining up. John Joe was no coward. Only his love for Sadie and baby Josephine held him back. News of death and injury were filtering back from the front. The atmosphere in the mill was worsening. The feeling of alienation towards those who had not joined up. There was a lot of resentment and talk of cowardice. And then the day came when a young woman John Joe knew and liked walked straight up to him after the lunch break and reached him a white feather. He knew what that meant. For John Joe, it was the last straw. It meant he was a coward and a shirker. He was a proud Irishman. Nobody would ever get away with calling him a coward. And to Sadie's horror, he decided to enlist. But not for him the Ulster Division like her brothers. Like many Irish nationalists hoping to achieve Irish home rule, he joined the Connaught Rangers. He was on his way to war, leaving behind his young wife and baby daughter. John Joe joined the Connaught Rangers when my mummy was just a wee baby. He didn't join the Ulster Division like her brothers. Oh no, he was very proud to be Irish. Many Irishmen joined all over the island. I suppose you know that. We learned about that in school, Granny. It said over 200,000 volunteered to fight. We were learning about war poets. And there was even one from the south of Ireland who got killed out there. That would be Francis Ledwidge. I remember learning about him as well. I loved history at school. He said, I joined the British Army because she stood between Ireland and an enemy of civilization. I would not have her say that she defended us while we did nothing but pass resolutions. Fine words. My granda went because he was called a coward by girls he worked with. I hope they were proud of themselves, telling other people how to lead their lives. It seems John Joe had always said he wanted to go off and see the world, but I don't think that's what he had in mind. His story was very different from the old tales. Day after his return to the island of loneliness, the Queen again called her son and said, your father is about to lose his life this day. Would you again go and try and save your father? The prince replied, with honour I would risk my life to save my father. The Queen said, because the king has still refused the princess who's twice before trying to have him killed, she's now succeeded in stirring his people up against him. He is a prisoner in his castle, and in a short time he'll be led out to the castle wall where 100 of the best marksmen in all of Donegal are going to shoot him dead with their arrows. You must instantly go and save him. She led the young prince out to the castle gate, and striking the gate with a wand 3 times, a winged horse appeared. She breathed 3 times on her son, saying, this is the breath of God's blessing. Now nothing can harm you. Ride to your father's castle. Stand between him and the archers. When the arrows fly, save his life. The young prince mounted the winged horse and flew off through the air like lightning. He reached his father's castle just as the king was being led out to the wall, where 100 of the best marksmen in Donegal were drawn up 100 paces from him. But as the princess, whom the people were about to make queen, gave the orders for the archers to bend their bows and shoot, the prince sprang in front of his father, stretching out his arms, and gathered to his own breast the 100 arrows that turned into lilies. And instantly he held this armful of fragrant lilies. Sadie would never forget the day John Joe left Derry to join his regiment. He kissed her tight, kissed baby Josephine, and promised he'd keep in touch. Tears flowed down her cheeks as she watched him walk away. They'd been in touch with his family in Donegal, but the reaction hadn't been good. Of course, they blamed her for putting him up to joining up. John Joe tried to explain to her what it was like for them in a remote corner of the island, not surrounded by recruiting posters and calls to arms. The Cassidys felt totally Irish, with none of that loyalty to England that Sadie's family had. In Ireland, the rallying call was going out to nationalists to join up, to defend the rights of small nationalities in the hope that as a return they'd get Irish home rule. John Joe felt that at least by enlisting with an Irish regiment at the front, he was keeping faith with his country. From the lack of communication from Donegal, Sadie could tell there was none of the pride that her own parents felt for her brother's service. Sadie anxiously awaited word from her husband. The first letters came and she replied, trying to sound cheerful, telling him about the baby's progress, even though her heart was breaking with loneliness and fear. She knew John Joe was somewhere in France, though he couldn't be specific about his whereabouts. He always said he was in the very best of health, and at least that was a relief, for she'd heard stories from her brothers of sickness and poor conditions. She sent him little parcels, pictures of Josephine, and he in return sent postcards. Sadie even started knitting socks, and John Joe knew that didn't come easily for her. But he always thanked her for the parcels and even made her smile by sending her a poem one of the English lads had sent. Dear lady, thank you for the socks. Some fit. One I use as a helmet, the other as a mitt. I hope to meet you someday when I have done my bit, but in the meantime, where the dickens did you learn to knit? Sometimes Sadie could tell things weren't going so well. John Joe wrote about rain and cold. The news of the sinking of the great liner Lusitania, torpedoed by a German submarine off the coast of Cork, brought the war even closer to Ireland. Many civilian lives were lost, and there was pressure on America to join the war. 1916 brought news of a different kind from Dublin. Those who wanted Irish freedom had taken part in a rebellion against British Crown forces. To Sadie's horror, she heard from him that John Joe's brother Patrick had travelled to Dublin to take part in the rising. John Joe felt betrayed, but this was a secret she'd have to keep from her family, whose two sons were off fighting for king and country. In the eyes of her family, it was bad enough that she'd married a Catholic, but if they ever found out that John Joe's brother was a rebel, they'd never believe he was any different. Back home in Derry, Sadie tried to picture what it was like for John Joe. His letters contained very little information, just asking about her and Josephine, who was now a toddler. He asked her to try and keep in touch with his family in Donegal, but though she sent letters and pictures of the baby, there was no response. Then came the awful news of the carnage at the Battle of the Somme. Her own two brothers had been plunged into that bloody battle. William, the eldest, was badly injured, but young Samuel was posted as missing in action. She tried to keep the noise from John Joe, but death was a daily part of his life. Many Irish households had been torn apart following the loss of loved ones. When her own brother William returned home, he was a changed man, embittered, showing little concern for a sister who'd married one of the other sort. William had a wound in his back where a piece of shrapnel had lodged, but the mental scars would never leave him. Poor Sadie was caught between a rock and a hard place, mourning the loss of one brother, trying to make peace with another, and clinging to the hope that her husband would come home to herself and her baby daughter. All she could do was pray. She'd sit rocking baby Josephine, singing songs and telling her the stories of John Joe. Somehow it made her feel closer to him. When the young prince stood between his father and death, the crowd surged forward with a great shout. The king sprang to the young prince and kissed him on the lips. And the moment the king's lips touched his son's, the memory of all the long-forgotten things came back to him. He recalled the island of loneliness and the beautiful queen, his wife. Then he proclaimed to all the people gathered there that he was indeed married to the most beautiful queen in the whole wide world. And this was his own son who 3 times saved his life. He told them of the adventures and how he'd lost his memory when a dog licked his lips. He gave them his son as the king of Donegal and went to the island of loneliness to fetch his queen for their son's crowning. There was never such joy and delight in any kingdom as there was that day in Donegal, for they were to crown the bravest young hero the world had ever seen. And if that day was joyous for the king and queen and their brave son, It was as happy for the people of Donegal, and each day was happier than the day before. After yet another cup of tea, Sarah lifted some pieces of paper. There were letters written in neat copperplate writing. Here's one of John Joe's letters home, dated 28th of April 1917. Emma held the flimsy piece of paper in her hand and read the words written so long ago. There was very little news, just thanking her for handkerchiefs and tobacco and wishing everyone well at home. And if God spares me, he said, I'll soon see you and wee Josephine again. Next, she lifted a piece of cloth with flags of different countries embroidered on it in bright colours. Souvenir de France, she read, proud of her pronunciation. Aye, John Joe would send wee things when he could to Sadie and Josephine. Pretty, isn't it? I've got some postcards somewhere, and one he's thanking her for the socks. Said it was very useful in rainy weather. I remember hearing some stories of tricks they played. It wasn't all gloom and doom, you know. There was one young boy who was a heavy sleeper, so one night they put bits of shrapnel and soil over him. When he woke up the next morning, they told him he'd slept through a raid. Hard to imagine the time for playing tricks. Just imagine wee Sadie, still in her early 20s, waiting on bits of news. Here's a letter he wrote on the 5th of June 1917. He even mentions her brother William, saying how glad he is he didn't come out again. Says he wouldn't be fit for it. Emma read through the letter and then stopped. It says last letter. Aye, Emma, that it was. Here's what poor Sadie got at the end of June. It is my painful duty to inform you that a report has been received from the War Office notifying the death of John Joseph Cassidy of the Connaught Rangers, killed in action. John Joe died in battle just 2 days after he wrote his last letter. I don't think she ever got over it. I remember when I was a wee girl, she would talk about him. She'd bring out the letters and cards to keep his memory fresh. She'd tell me his stories as well. My favourite was the one about Oisin. You probably know that one. The boy that went off to the land of forever young. When she was an old lady, she'd take John Joe's picture and look at it, remembering the times when they were both young. It was as if he was frozen in time. She never got out to France to see where he was buried, and she never even went to see the place in Donegal. The Cassidys cut off all contact with her. Always found that so sad. But now there's something I want you to see. Sarah lifted up a bronze plaque. This is for you, Emma. It's something really special. Your granny, Josephine, kept this in her mantelpiece and polished it every day. It's called the Dead Man's Penny. That's what Sadie got after John Joe was killed. See what it says on it? He died for freedom and honour. Not much to show for all that bravery, all that loss of life. Seems they made 1.5 million of these. But Sadie was very proud of it. It's been handed down through the generation, and it's your turn to have it now, Emma. I want you to look after it and think of poor John Joe. Emma held the dead man's penny in her hand and looked at the name, John Cassidy. Now she knew the story. She'd be the one to go to Donegal and retrace the steps of that young man who'd never had the chance to return to his homeland. She'd see he was never forgotten. The grey road stops at the sea that rocks the island of the dead, where the unclaimed and the unbaptized are abandoned to a dull, harsh rest, restless as absence, elusive as the smells of a childhood kitchen.